to kind of touch on some slightly more controversial works of scholarship at the minute, but David Toombs and some other people have done some really important work on Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse.
Covenant.
I'd like to discuss what this means then for the assurance of someone's salvation, because I suppose if someone stays in sin and they don't go back to Jesus, does that mean that they might lose their salvation? Johnny, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. I know it's a big question.
Yeah, thank you for coming to me with that question. Yeah, it's a big one, and there is a really tricky passage in Hebrews 6 where it kind of addresses this, and it talks about, once you have fallen away, you can't then go back to Christ, because it would be like re-crucifying Christ, essentially, which is always a tricky passage to preach on and to teach. My reading of Hebrews is that there is that assurance there. The language of Hebrews is that this has been done once for all. And so I think in Hebrews 6, the author of Hebrews is talking about a hypothetical. Like this isn't possible in theory because this has been done once for all, right? And so as David said towards the end there, Hebrews wants to say that everything that Jesus has done is like but better than what happens in Leviticus. Because every component part of Jesus' sacrifice in that broad sense of that ongoing process, is better than the Levitical counterpart. So just on a basic, very mundane level, Jesus' life is more valuable than a bull, right? Because it is the life of ultimate human obedience to God. This is one of the fascinating things about Hebrews, is that Hebrews never talks about faith in Christ. It only ever talks about faith in God, and often it's Christ's faith in God, the Father. And it's this life of perfect faithfulness that is offered to the Father. And so the thing being offered is better. The location where it's offered is better, because it's not in the heavenly temple. It's not on the earthly temple, it's in the heavenly temple. It's in the very presence of God. And the high priest performing the ritual is better, because the Levitical high priests pass away and die. Hebrews just makes that very basic point. They are mortals. They will pass away and die at some point. They will have to be replaced. But Jesus is a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, in the way that we talked about. And so the way I read Hebrews is it kind of entertains this possibility of losing the effect of that sacrifice. But I think in practice, my reading of Hebrews is that I don't think he thinks that's possible. That once this is done, it is done, whether you like it or not, kind of thing.
Yeah. David, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I read Hebrews a bit differently on this point. I think Hebrews is serious in this warning, but I think here I would want to say, from a more theological and indeed even pastoral point of view, Hebrews is not the only text in the New Testament. There are other passages, and I think Paul, for example, this Romans 8:34 through 39 passage that we talked about in the last session, Paul seems to say that because of the ongoing intercession of the one who died and rose and is at the right hand, nothing can separate us from the love of God. I think Paul takes how we live very, very seriously. Sometimes that can be kind of diminished a bit when we read Paul and think, well, if nothing can separate you, then who cares how you live? I think there are good theological ways to address that question. But ultimately, in a text like Romans, at the end of Romans 8, Paul seems to be putting everything on the work of Jesus. That is what brings assurance and security. And I think Hebrews doesn't quite view it that way, in that Hebrews, I think, thinks you can separate yourself ultimately if you choose to walk away from this community. And I think this is where he takes the story of Esau, which he refers to in 12:18, and the story of Israel at Kadesh Barnea, who refused to obey God and end up missing the inheritance. He takes that as a pretty serious warning. Now, this is the only, I assume that this is the only writing in the New Testament we have from this author. Whoever wrote Hebrews was intended, I think, to be preached as a sermon. I would hate to extrapolate, an entire theology for this person based on this sermon. But I think Hebrews on its own terms is a bit more, is a bit harsher in terms of that warning. But Hebrews is not the only text in the New Testament. And Paul in Romans 8, 1 John and 1 John 1:7 through 2:2, and even Hebrews itself with the idea of Jesus perpetually interceding on behalf of his people, are continually holding out this idea that this is work that is done for you. So it's not you earning your salvation. It is Jesus who is doing it for you. Avail yourself of the opportunity to return to God. In some way, this is a bit far afield, but in some way, Luke's parable of what we call the prodigal son, when he goes away, he disgraces his family, he disgraces himself, he squanders his inheritance from his father. He as much as says to his father, "I wish you were dead." And then he realizes, "I made a huge mistake." And he goes back to his father, and his father is waiting for him and comes running out and embraces him. I feel like that's the general idea that Jesus' perpetual intercession provides for us in our relationship with God. That there is a means there, and it's Jesus, and he desires us to come back. And that is a means that is always there for us, because the risen Jesus always lives to intercede for us.
Johnny, I want to talk also about the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, or the Lord's Supper. It has many names and many different theologies that attach to it. I suppose the most basic view would be that this is just a memorial. We are just sort of remembering Jesus' death. But on the other hand, you have the view that this is actually some kind of sacrifice, that it's a participation in what's going on in the heavenly realms. And when I sort of encountered David's thesis, I thought, oh gosh, this actually sounds like a lot more like a Catholic view of what's happening in the Eucharist, that Jesus is sort of always interceding and sort of presenting his blood, his life to God. I wonder, does this have any bearing on how we might view the Lord's Supper today?
Yeah, I'm sure it does. I mean, I think it's not insignificant that it is Jesus' body and blood that we're talking about, because as David really helpfully explained earlier, they are the key material components of sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is a sense in which, if, as Leviticus 17 says really clearly, the life of the creature is in the blood, then what's happening, in my opinion, when you partake of the Eucharist, when you drink this blood, is that you are participating in Jesus' life. But crucially, again, not just his death, the whole thing, the whole sweep of that incarnate resurrection life is the thing that you are participating in, right? And that has all sorts of, I think, really important pastoral implications for the life of discipleship today. I mean, you very kindly mentioned that I have this book coming out next year, which is called The Cross Enough. If the cross is not enough, just to give a kind of slight spoiler warning for what the book is going to argue. But in that, I kind of try to tease out some of the implications of all of this stuff that we've been talking about for the Christian life. And one of the things I argue is, if what Jesus argues is the perfect life of human faithfulness, then Jesus' human life shows us something about what human flourishing looks like. And actually that leads to all sorts of really surprising things, right? Because, well, it doesn't look like getting married and having kids, because Jesus didn't do that as far as we know. It doesn't look like wealth and luxury. And one of the places I go to in the book, and this is maybe to kind of touch on some slightly more controversial works of scholarship at the minute, but David Toombs and some other people have done some really important work on Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse, and specifically in the moment of crucifixion. When the crucifixion is depicted in art, it's often, he's often kind of clothed in some sense, but We know that is not what would have happened at the crucifixion.
Yeah.
He would have been kind of displayed publicly, completely naked. And people like David Toombs argue, I think really convincingly, that this is a form of sexualized violence. It is a form of sexual abuse. I mean, we know that the whole point of crucifixion was to make a public display of its victims, right? And so if we're talking about a Messiah who lives the perfect human life and yet is in some way a victim of sexual abuse, I mean, that is huge.
Yeah.
Right? That is huge in all sorts of ways. It's not to glorify the violence, but what it is to do is to say that none of that abuse or violence downgrades or diminishes the quality of Jesus' life.
Yeah.
Because it is precisely that life that is offered to the Father. And so I think, and this is we're now a world away from the Eucharist, but I think there is something really important there about the life of survivors of abuse and the value and worth of their life, and something about Jesus participating in that as well. Yeah. I mean, like I say, we've gone way off from Eucharist, so I can.
And that can be teased out in many different directions, because obviously people have often spoken about the disabled God on the cross as well, and how, I mean, there might be debates about whether you classify Jesus as disabled or a non-able-bodied person on the cross, but or whether he's temporarily impaired. But that doesn't seem to take away from his perfect value in that moment when his body is broken.
From everything we know about the gospel accounts of the resurrection and the post-resurrection appearances, when Christ is serving as high priest in heaven, offering atonement for our sins, he's doing so with a wounded body, right? Because those wounds are there after the resurrection.
Yeah.
And this is, as David said, this is the perfect culmination of humanity. And it is deeply wounded.
Yeah.
And I think there are all sorts of really important things that we can draw out from that in terms of how we respond to victims of violence and abuse in all sorts of different ways. That Christ shows us in his post-resurrection body that whilst those things are horrific, they do not downgrade or devalue the worth of the human that suffers them.